Hi everyone. So I'm Huw from GHL Sourcing. We are a sourcing agent, or I suppose we like to call ourselves a procurement company. It was interesting hearing Ben talk about experts, and I suppose we're experts in manufacturing and supply chain monitoring, and really the purchasing and the logistics elements. So everything sort of behind the scenes on products. We only work with OEM or sort of own brands manufacturing. So the core of our business is actually supplying sort of big retailers. So in the UK, for example, we supply Kingfisher, we supply Argos Sainsbury's, Homebase, we work with Starbucks, those guys. And over the last 5 or so years, we've started to work more with e-commerce brands. It's really interesting for us because the big retailers, they have their own procurement systems that you're forced to work within. And so our systems essentially have been set up around those systems, which are good practice, essentially, and designed to reduce risk and to make sure that you get the product you want, the quality is there, the price is there, and really all the things that are important behind the scenes. So the first thing, and for us when we're starting on a new product, and I think it's important for everyone because they don't think about it, is actually really knowing your product. And a lot of people, I think, jump into it. They rely on potentially a manufacturer or an agent to give them the information that they don't know. And I don't always think that that's a good idea. I think that it's important that you understand it. And there's a great example of that. So a lot of eco products at the moment are becoming popular, and bamboo fibre is a particular product. It's essentially, it looks like plastic. A lot of factories, a lot of manufacturers will describe bamboo fibre as an eco product, but actually it's mixed with a resin, and they call it resin deliberately rather than melamine, which it actually is. And everyone will have heard of melamine, its problems when it comes in contact with hot fluids, things like that, it leaches chemicals out. And as a result, bamboo fibre is now banned in the European Union. And yet, that isn't what you will be told when you're searching for a product of that nature. And so again, I think it's really important that you understand your product, the materials, what it is you're buying, and really the manufacturing techniques, because again, having had a lot of experience with manufacturers globally, you very rarely walk into a factory and they go, no, we can't make that. Most of the time they turn around and say, of course we can make anything. Whereas they can't, and they're acting potentially as a sourcing agent, you're one step further away and don't necessarily have the control that you want. So we're going to have to run through the slides quite quickly because there's a lot to cover. Next, compliance, really, really big issue. As the importer of the product, it's your responsibility to make sure that that product is compliant within the territory. People forget about compliance, and it's not something that should be overlooked. You need to understand what UKCA marking is, how it applies to your product. I've put some examples up here because some of you might not have seen the documentation, but this is an EC declaration of conformity, or a sort of a template for one. If you have a children's product, a toy product, you will require one of those in place. And next to it is an SGS test report. Essentially, this is an EN71 test report showing a pass, but you may not have seen it. Factories can be very, very good at supplying you with documents that don't necessarily hit the mark on what you need. It needs to have your name on it, it needs to have the SKU, it needs to have your product code on it, it needs to have the manufacturer on there for these to be valid. And so again, I think it's really important that you understand the requirements, and Amazon is becoming very hot on this. Because ultimately they're selling your product, and therefore they will ask you for a CPC for a children's product in the US. They will ask you for your declaration of conformity. And so putting together your technical file is really important. And the big one, as a sourcing agent, how do you find suppliers? I suppose the first one is procurement companies like us. The reason that we work with the big retailers is because they're not necessarily experts in that area. Our pricing works for them. We do add a commission, you're not wrong, but our pricing will be more competitive because of our relationships. And those relationships are really important. Networking groups, again, not to be overlooked. Do you know what I mean? Other people making referrals for businesses, really important. Markets, actual physical markets within the territory that you're looking at. I think it's worth Also going to trade shows. Trade shows can be brilliant for connecting with manufacturers, great for connecting with agents and procurement teams. And also don't forget about government sources. They organise trade missions, they have Chamber of Commerce. There's a lot of different ways to find the right manufacturers for you. Which country is right for you? Right, so our office is in China, which says something. And so when looking at products, sometimes it can be difficult not to look at China. However, I think it's really important that you cast your net wider. A great example for us is we supply roof boxes into Halfords. Those roof boxes are huge. The cost of freight from China to the UK is high, so we get them from Italy. The injection mould industry in Italy is great, so we look further afield. We buy garden furniture from Cambodia, clothing and textiles from Turkey, as well as looking at sort of countries with different tariff incentives. So the duty rate is not the same from every country. Bangladesh is a great example. We buy camping equipment from Bangladesh because the duty rate is 0. We were actually forced by our retail clients to move production to Bangladesh because of the duty rate. And so again, it's worth looking further afield and seeing what you can find. The big one, sourcing problems. Everyone at some stage will have encountered an issue, unless you've been very, very lucky. I think that history is a great predictor of the future. And so if you're working with a manufacturer that has successfully done something for years and years and years, they're highly likely to continue doing it successfully. We don't have time to go through all of the questions, but they're up here, and I think the slides will be sent out to you afterwards. I think it's important when you're establishing the relationship to ask as many questions as you can, and don't have that kind of very British attitude of not asking. If you don't know, ask. That's our philosophy anyway. The big one, and I think Ben talked about it actually, was the certification for the factory. Again, these organisations exist to qualify a manufacturer and to give you an idea of their standards, and so they can be very useful. The certification of a factory does come with cost implications though. That certification is not free of charge, and therefore you're likely to pay a slightly higher price for a factory that has all that certification in place. Evaluating them. So I've put our brief factory overview. So when we're doing our evaluation, we look at a number of different criteria. So obviously the quality of the product is a good start, but quality is not a defined term. And so what I consider to be the right quality might not be what you consider to be the right quality. And also price does tend to be a good reflector of quality. So the next one is delivery, and at the moment logistics is a headache for everyone, and so I think looking at the logistics options, looking at price, looking at how you're going to get the goods over, the timing that you require is all important, as well as the experience. Payment terms, again, standard payment terms of 30/70 on most new stuff, but up for negotiation. Don't be afraid to sort of look at that. And really for us, the big one, and it's at the end, is how easy it is to work with them. Like they're really important to you. Giving your sourcing agent, your manufacturer, they're going to become your best friends. Do you know what I mean? And for us over the years, we've become incredibly close with some of our key sort of manufacturers. And so that kind of how easy they are to work with is going to be a really important one. To the side as well. So again, you may not have seen them, but this is an Amafest BSCI report. That's a sort of a social audit, becoming more and more important. The big retailers won't touch your product unless you have manufacturing with that in place. And next to it is an SGS ISO 9000 certificate. They don't all look exactly like that, but you can look at the level of detail on that report. You should be contacting SGS to verify that those are real, because there's a lot of fake reports out there. And so I think it's really important that you check that what you're getting is right. Again, we're not going to have time to go through them all. When you're setting up your supplier, I think it's worth obviously talking about price, lead times, but you want a quality guarantee in there to a certain level. Do you know what I mean? The LQL sort of levels are important. Do you know what I mean? Understanding what those LQL sort of levels are is important. And ultimately as well, there can be additional benefits for suppliers, like some of them will hold stock and allow you to call it off. And calling off stock can be a really good option if you don't want to ship it all at the same time, or you're shipping internationally to different distributors, etc. This is an overview of our procurement process, really basically, and there's a couple of key points in here that some of you might be tempted to skip, which all depends on how risk averse you are, really. So when we start, we put together our statement of work, which is all of the technical sort of parameters of the product. And really, if you have CE marking, you should have a technical file for each product anyway. And so it would form that going forward. Factory visits can be important, but really the sample process, you shouldn't really be buying anything unless you've seen the product already, unless you're willing to take the risk that it's going to arrive and it's all wrong. And so really, that sample process is important, and it creates what we refer to as gold seal samples. So those gold seal samples are used during a pre-shipment inspection as the quality standards of the product. If you don't have a sample and you aren't able to have a sealed sample that you send to the factory, then your pre-shipment inspection has limited use. It's more of an overview rather than it being a quality comparison. And so again, sort of good practice dictates sealed samples are required, sealed samples are needed. Your formal contract, most of the time with international procurement, that contract is formed by your purchase order. And so it's worth making sure that all of the right clauses are in there for you. Again, you might not be able to make the final or sample the final product before you place the order. For example, if you've got batch dyeing that's going on, or you've got printing plates for logos, those sorts of things, you should still get a pre-production sample that comes out to you so that you can verify that it's correct before you go into manufacturing. And then at this stage, it's the quality control part of it. Again, it depends on the value of your purchase, but you can conduct production inspections, you can conduct a pre-shipment inspection. For us, with any new product or new supplier, we will inspect every shipment for the first 12 months. If there's no problems within the first 12 months, we will go on to random inspections. And those random inspections normally about 30% of the time. And then it's just a case of sort of feeding back into the system per order. Right, so with your contract, from what we've seen in procurement, a lot of the time it's overlooked. And the importance of that is yeah, it was crazy. But you wouldn't sort of instruct this kind of work or this kind of stuff without sort of putting a contract in place in the UK. And so it's strange that people do it with arm's length deals. But I think it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. But have your quality assurance clauses, have your late delivery clauses. I mean, put your intellectual property sort of ownership into those contracts, and then they can be used then as a reference point afterwards. And also payment terms, they're up for negotiation. I mean, it can start at 30/70, but you can negotiate no deposit on ordering. You can elongate the sort of payment terms beyond the sort of payment on delivery. Shipping is a big one. One of the things with purchasing products is you need to understand the Incoterms that you're purchasing your product on. Now, they vary greatly, and without sort of knowledge, they can be quite confusing. There is a diagram and table here that outlines exactly where or who's responsible for which bit and where the ownership sort of transfers. And knowing where ownership transfers is really important for your insurance. If you have cargo insurance, you need to ensure that that cargo insurance covers you from your ownership of the goods. We have heard horror stories of people buying ex-works, their cargo insurance is FOB, goods get destroyed between factory and port, no one's covered it. And so it is an important thing to look at. It's also worth making sure that your packaging is suitable for the method of transport. So if you've got a glass product, maybe palletise the goods before you ship them. If you're air freighting it, look maybe to reinforce the corners of boxes to make sure that it sort of arrives in the correct form. And also your insurance will ask you, was the packaging suitable? And so if it isn't, they won't pay you. And so again, it's worth making sure that these are done. And also, again, you need to work out what your landed cost for the product is. So international procurement means that the cost of the product is not the cost for you to get it to your warehouse. There is product cost, shipping cost, duty, use of deferment. Some forwarders will charge percentages rather than a fixed rate, or congestion charges, and then the big one, VAT. I mean, is Is that an additional cost? Are you registered? Do you have your URI number in place? Paying for the goods. So most of the time, goods are paid for via BACS transfer, or also known as telegraphic transfer. High street banks are seriously expensive for this kind of stuff, and so it is worth shopping around. There are FX companies out there that will take the money off the exchange rate rather than charging you for the transfer. It is worth looking at. There's also different trade assurance measures that you can put in place with escrow accounts and things like that to protect the product and protect your sort of money. And then a very old-fashioned, but is still sometimes used, is a letter of credit, which essentially means that you don't pay for it, but your bank supplies a letter of credit to the supplier. That letter confirms that you have the funds, and those funds are essentially frozen until you release them. It's not something that's seen that much at the moment, but it still can be useful. US dollars is the sort of the main currency for it. Importing goods. So obviously, when you're looking at international procurement, you have to work out your landed cost. You need to know what your duty rate is. They're all listed. All of the HS codes are listed on the UK.gov website. And so go on there, find out what it is. It's really important. And if you're looking at new products, sometimes it's worth having a look at what that HS code is. Educational products have a lower rate than some of the counter sort of products. And so again, it's worth looking at there. And you need to make sure that you understand the import process. And so you will need to clear customs with the goods. You will require a commercial invoice and a packing list. If you're sea freighting it, you will have a bill of lading. That bill of lading, you either need the original or you need to get the telex released, essentially, which is the electronic version. And then in relation to VAT on import, there's two ways. You can use the deferred system, which is the PVA, and you will need to authorise your customs clearance company to tick that box on imports, or you can use a C79. And I've put an example up because most people don't know what they are, but it looks like that, and don't throw it away. You will need it. And so it's worth sort of knowing this, and obviously all of this is related to your URI number, and if you're VAT registered, your URI number is your VAT number. If you're not registered, it is completely different. If you're transferring from being non-VAT registered to VAT registered, you will need a new number. And so don't just continue trading on your old URI number, you will need to get it updated. There are also different customs routes on entry. And so it's worth having a look at those because most of the time goods clear quite quickly, but if they don't, you need to be aware of it. And you can incur some pretty high costs if the goods are in storage for a long time. Yeah, so the biggest cultural difference that we found, originally is the language barrier. And so it's really easy for someone to pretend to speak a language. And so you'll be talking to someone and they will nod away like they understand every word you're saying, and that isn't necessarily the truth. And so I'd make sure that things are sort of followed up in writing if possible, confirmed, in diagrams, all those sorts of things to make sure that they are clearly understood if you're talking to someone in a different language. The other thing is addressing problems. So a lot of countries don't like pinpointing problems onto an individual. In China it's referred to as their face culture, but I think it exists everywhere, if I'm honest. I think it's important that the problems are addressed in a in a good manner, but also in a polite manner, so that you're not necessarily sort of asserting blame on an individual for something. And also I think that you've got to go on fact-finding. So ambiguity is where you lead to problems. And we found over the years that anything that doesn't look quite right, just keep asking the questions. So if you're unsure if a certificate is right, keep asking. If you're unsure that they understand what you're talking about in production, keep asking. But it's more important that you get it right than you just leave it go because you don't want to be rude. Okay, so I suppose as a quick overview, you've got to know your product, you've got to verify your factory, whether that be through certification, visiting it, sort of all those sorts of things. Check on your production and goods before you pay for them, and that's part of the pre-shipment inspection sort of element. Know your purchasing terms so that you're aware of actually when you're buying it and when it's yours, and make sure that you've got all the documents ready. So that's been done.
questions for Huw?
Right.
Hi, Huw. How do you see the peak season shipping surcharge playing out? Have you fed into it?
No, if I'm honest. Logistics is sort of an absolute minefield at the moment. I mean, we've all been watching the prices just go up and up and up on shipping. I think unfortunately it's here for the foreseeable. There's a couple of new vessels that are meant to be sort of coming out, and so pricing should come down in that regard. But I think you've got to look at it differently. Optimise your product, optimise your packaging, and make sure that you've got the product that is the most efficient it can be at the moment to try and minimise those costs. And also, look at supply chain resilience. Look at alternative suppliers for product, maybe in countries which are closer at lower shipping rates. I think there's a lot of options. If you're primarily buying textiles out of China, then look towards Turkey, look towards India. Look at alternatives where potentially the shipping cost isn't going to hurt quite so much. Would be my advice.
Great, thank you. I don't think this is working, so
I can talk loud enough, yeah. Have you got any advice if you've got an existing supplier you've dealt with for a while, pretty good, but they're getting a little bit slack on those purchase orders where you're saying put the terms in? Have you got any advice on how to get, if you haven't had those, how to kind of get them in? Like, what's the best way to put that across to your supplier without offending them?
I'd go with directly, if I'm honest. Obviously, don't be rude, but to the same extent, if they're late on delivery, then talk to them about it. There might be good reasons why they're late on delivery. Raw materials might take longer. It might be that sometimes they're just trying to give you the answer that you want rather than the truth. And so just try and give them the opportunity to tell you what it is. And lead times are a problem at the moment because of raw material sort of supplies. And so we're seeing lead times, especially on sort of plush items and certain textiles elements, all the way up to sort of 90 days. And I know from experience that if one of our suppliers turns around to me and says, we can get it to you in 45 days, it's just not true. And so I think it's worth sort of having a conversation with them about it. And then after that conversation, put a penalty clause in there. So look at, say, if the goods are 14 days late, there's a percentage reduction in the unit cost. And trust me, at that stage, it will be ready before the penalty clause. And so I just discuss it with them. Yeah, cheers.
Thanks. Sorry, Huw, I think that's fantastic. I think it's well worth. You work with a lot of different big companies, Kingfisher, Starbucks, so forth. I'm just a very humble FBA Amazon seller, right?
Yeah.
What are the key differences? Because some of these costs look Churchillian in kind of filling up and so forth. Yeah. I mean, have you worked enough with e-commerce with FBA smaller brands to say, well, what are the differences? Not cut corners, but how can we make it more efficient for these smaller sellers? Because I'm worried about getting inventory in because my restock limit is going down. Yep. So I'm not worried about international legality. Well, I am, but not compared to bigger brands. What are your thoughts?
I suppose let's put it sort of bluntly. So if HMRC, if customs see a non-compliant product and you get trading standards involved, they will decimate your business. They will find every single person you have sent that product to, and they will get it removed and destroyed. And so I don't know if there is a shortcut around compliance, in all honesty. It's certainly not a shortcut that we would take.
Sure. But do you think many FBA sellers, Amazon sellers, are just naive and they just don't know?
Yeah, I do. And I think that it's something that people should be aware of, is that if trading standards come across that product and they then look at it, they then test it, and it is not compliant, they will go with a fine-tooth comb across your stock, your inventory, and all of it, and they will just destroy it. And so it is, I think, an important step to make sure that you have your compliance in place. And also from a moral point of view, if you're selling a children's product, make sure it's right. You do not want a dangerous product going into the marketplace that potentially could hurt or even kill a child. And so I think that there is the financial risk involved in losing stock, but there's also that kind of moral element of making sure that what you've got and what you're putting your brand into is fit for purpose. So yeah, I don't know if there is a shortcut, in honesty.
Very interesting. We've probably got time for one more question for anyone else. Okay, one more. Okay, two more. Quick ones. It doesn't work anyway.
How flexible can you be when you're choosing the HS code?
Yeah, so you can contact HMRC and they will give you their advice on which code they think it belongs to. If that still doesn't really fit what you want it to, you can get what's known as a binding tariff decision, and that binding tariff decision is legally binding, and therefore you know with certainty that product falls under that category. You've got to be really careful with that because HMRC will go backwards. So if they find out that you've been importing a product under the wrong HS code, they will go back as far as they want, and they will then charge you the right duty codes on the goods that you've imported. And I've seen it happen, not with us, a client that's come to us and literally, I think they had a 20, 30 grand bill for years worth of using the wrong code. So again, be careful.
Yeah, I don't need the microphone, I'll just ask you. So I've got a two-part question. The first is, in your experience with importing, it could be the UK or pretty much anywhere in the world, with customs, how strict are they? There's compliance elements for import and then there's compliance elements for sale, and some of those can be different.
Yeah.
Are HMRC or customs officers going after the importers mainly for import requirements, or are they also looking for sale requirements at import?
So the table I showed you with the different routes essentially dictates which they're looking at. So they're either checking your documentation for import, and therefore highly likely the HS code you're looking, or they'll go into further checks. But the trading standards and customs are not the same thing. The trading standards department will contact you once the goods have gone through customs. So you will already have paid your customs duty on it, and then they will contact you, and then they will do the checks on the product and the compliance within that. And so it's two separate things. You've got documentation for import that's dealt with by customs, and then you've got trading standards that deal with product compliance. But I think they talk, and so if customs see something coming through and they go, that doesn't look right, they'll just phone trading standards and say, check that out. And so, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And then would they go after the seller, let's say in a foreign market, for something that was like a trading standard that wasn't right? Or
who says that compliance situation is the same in territory? This is one of the reasons why it's so important. The standards between the US and the UK are not the same. The standards between the UK and Europe are now not the same. And so really you need to look at it globally if you're looking at a product like that. And so UK trading standards have no authority within Europe or the US, and so they stick to what they know. They'll only look at product coming into our territory. But again, US and Amazon takes some responsibility when it comes to compliance. If you want to put a child's product in Amazon US, they will ask for all of your certification and they will check it. And if you don't have something, they will not list you. And so again, it's really important to make sure that you've got it for the territories you're selling in, rather than just the UK.
Okay, great. Thank you, Huw. We'll give you a rest now.